West Hollywood apartment of Eli Delson, known throughout the world as Doc.
That's it.
Doc, show us a little bit about your apartment first. About that beautiful rug on the
On
wall.
the floor here you have a hand-woven rug made in Baluchistan. Okay.
Hmm.
It's what they call a mansion size. See? It's
Yeah.
15 feet long.
Hmm.
And very intricate work, and the more I look at it, the more I find very mysterious little messages by the objects here. As long as I've lived here, I've never really known the full extent of the various intricate messages that's woven in here.
Hmm. What about that rug on the wall over
And on
there?
the wall is a finer woven, more of the Persian type. It's something like 190 knots per square inch, made out of a finer yarn. That comes from the Caucasus,
Hmm.
the northern part of Persia. And I replaced this with from a picture. This is a Chinese rug, which is where they use heavier yarns, and you have less yarns per inch, but you have the same weight. Now this floor is all woven in. It's not embroidered, but it's woven in. If you'll notice the blending of the colors, the shading, that's all done as they weave by hand. I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces that I have.
Beautiful.
My interest in these rugs is because my background is in textiles. And anything that is art and textiles interests me. I will hold it up. Can I hold it up? Chris?
Yes, of course.
You're
I'd
right.
like to. I've already gotten a pretty good look at it, but why not? Beautiful rug.
Up to Crystal Street?
Yes.
See, from Crystal Street we moved closer in to the knitting plant and the store, in a neighborhood closer there because it would be more convenient. And at that time, we were already teenagers, and the particular childhood things had graduated and revolved into the teenage syndrome.
Mhm.
And although we kept up the same traditions of music and home life for about 4 years before the various rift came in. Should I mention that in the family?
Yeah, you were telling me about your work within the factory and in the store.
Well,
that was
came
interesting.
later. See,
Yeah.
this is teenage. See, I was going to high school.
Uh-huh.
See, and in the first year of high school is when I was stricken with this terrible bone infection. And
In your leg.
in my leg, in my left leg. And I was out for a full year.
Hmm.
So the school that I went to was a special technical school in the Chicago system, which was one of the finest in the world. The principal had full autonomy how to run the school and what the courses would be. I wanted to transfer out because I couldn't stand the rigors of being that was a preparatory for engineering, and I wanted just to take the regular courses, and he didn't want to let me go because his funding was according to the amount of students they had in the school. So they fixed up a course for me where I wouldn't have to take the heavy shop work and engine and all the technical stuff that had lifting and maybe be injury to my leg moving around in the various departments. So this particular school was different than any high school in Chicago. The regular routine was from 9 o'clock till 2:30. This school started at 8 o'clock and let out at 4 because besides the engineering courses, preparatory for engineering, they had the general liberal arts courses. So they filled me up with about 2 years' work to catch up, and I went to school from 8:30 till 4 o'clock, with only a half an hour for lunch. And I could make up that year And then I made a half a year one summer to catch up, see, in order to enter their college, which was just being completed in the next block, see, which was a preparatory for engineers. And when I came back, naturally I was behind one year, and one of my roommates, not roommates, but one of my fellow students was the celebrated Hyman Rickover, the father of the American atomic submarine. And so we had quite a class there. And my courses included 2 languages, French and German, okay, mathematics, 2 sciences, 2 types of English, you see, a 3rd and 4th year English.
That was the beginning of your multilingual ability.
Yeah. And there was one of the very few high schools in Chicago that had PhDs as instructors. I was especially interested in science. I took up in the next 2.5 years, see, to physiology, zoology, botany, and one course with a great professor, J. Howard Moore, on the subject was the laws of biogenesis, see, which was very, very interesting. Now, in my physiology and zoology, I was one of the very few students that received A plus 100 in that. I'm not much of an artist, but I drew the most perfect skeleton on the bones of the body and knew every one of them by name in physiology. And so that's how I got through and remained in that school. See, instead of going to the regular high school. Now this was all boys school only. There was no girls there. In those days, they wouldn't admit girls to this type of school, which today they do. And it was very well renowned. Out of that school come some of the great architects in the Chicago area that throughout the country built some terrific buildings. And so it was quite an experience. And the same was in their college. There was a 2-year college. I stayed a year and a half, and I was talked in by my mother to go to the business because there was a great future there, and as far as education, I had enough, and I would learn more and advance greater in life, which seemed feasible as that business grew. So that's how I got into that the business.
And what about your brothers at this time? Were they going
My
to...
brother Abner was working there, and he left. He got in controversy with my father and this other woman. See? He interfered there, and so he was let go, and he was out of work.
He was trying to run your father's business or something?
Well, he ran it. He ran that one department, the store. The second floor was the factory. That was built specially for us at that time. There was an old building that was torn down, and this was built specially. And he was very good, a terrific retail man, terrific salesman. But then he lived at home with us, and he was out of work for practically a year. And he got a position as an assistant advertising manager in a department store. And he didn't like it because the office was in the basement, and he was a kind of a health fiend and thought the air wasn't fresh, so he quit. And later on, he got a position with a large firm that made gaskets for automobiles, the biggest in the country. And he became sales manager at a very young age. And he did a terrific job. See, then he got married, and at a very young age he was really, well, more or less into that marriage for, I would say that is, I don't know how to express it, but it was a question of a relief or something like that. He lived near us, and he was general sales manager. It was the biggest gasket manufacturers in the world. They had almost a monopoly of the gaskets for automobiles. The people that owned it were ordinary machinists and craftsmen, but the older brother was a little better educated, and he was more refined. But the other brothers were what you call laborers, and so naturally they had great respect for him. And he had a contract with them, and so later on, after he was there 3-4 years, the president, who became a social climber because he became a multimillionaire and belonged to the exclusive WASP clubs. And he used to take Abner there for lunch and so on. And the other members of the clubs, what you call the big financial establishment, was telling him, well, you don't want this kid around, you know, he's not our kind. You get the idea?
Mm.
So he didn't want to let him, he couldn't let him go because he had a contract. So Abner made a financial settlement with him, see, and left. And so that went up all the way till 1921, 22.
At that point, Pete was still very young.
Pete was young,
Yeah.
and Pete was, at that time, Pete was going to college, see, 1920 and 21. Pete was going to college, and I was there, and we had opened up what we called the large store. The factory and the smaller store was 4 or 5 blocks north of the new large store.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stayed in the small store and then ran the factory.
Mhm.
So we switched to run the factory. So
I was interested yesterday in what you were telling me about how the store was organized and what the factory did and how they transported the bills and so on.
yeah, and so we made all the things that we could make. The store had a very great variety of goods, so many were bought in large quantities as wholesalers. We had a wholesale department also.
Remind us of the name of the company because
The name of our company
Yeah.
was Delson Knitting Mills Incorporated.
Mhm.
The trademark was Del So. And now this was made and drawn up by the advertising agency, the logo. It was a very beautiful logo. It was a slant, beautiful in red, and the word trademark between the L and the N. And so I reorganized the factory because we had wonderful mechanics, but they didn't know anything about organization or costs. So I organized the thing I charged the big store, which was the main outlet, a regular wholesale price. So they knew where to mark up from, and we showed a profit.
everything you made was knitted from wool.
All knitted goods, a great variety of goods. Yeah, I designed the new styles and lined it up, and down in the first floor was the retail. So we put one of the saleswomen who was very intelligent. She was a Polish lady and very statuesque. Made her the manager over the girls to run it, and I would just look in once in a while because I was busy on the second floor watching the factory. We put in a couple of new finishing machines, and I also upgraded the stuff, the merchandise, in a better range. He was catering more to the lower price, more to the new immigrant trade that was coming in the early century.
Mhm.
So I restyled a lot of the stuff and attracted people from the western suburbs, see, which is called the carriage trade. There's one particular number that we made that was very successful. We upgraded that from a $10 seller to a $13.50 seller by making a new design, and we brought in a new machine because it was a combination of a reefer front with a pocket. See, so we had to cut the goods to make 2 pieces, so there was no salvage edge.
Mhm.
See, it would ravel. So I ordered a machine that was a shelling machine. It made a shell stitch, like a hand crocheted shell, which covered the raw edge. First we salvaged it and made a beautiful thing, a combination colors. And this was the the most successful thing. We used to send out loads of that in great big wash baskets daily. They were grabbing them up. Now, that year was the first year that the factory actually showed a profit.
How many people were employed in the factory?
The factory was close to 30 people.
Mm-hmm.
See, it was a 25 by 150 feet, the size. It was a pretty good size. And down in the basement was the yarns. I fenced off the entrance to the yarns with a regular fence and gates with locks, and it was organized, and no one could go down unless they got the key to get the yarn by requisition. See, before they would just take the yarn as they needed it, and whether they wasted or they made a mistake. This way we calculated, everything went by weight. If a certain garment weighed 12 pounds to the dozen, and we were going to put in a 5 dozen order of that color, we got only so many pounds. They went down and got an acquisition and brought off only so many pounds. See, there was a lot of waste and mistakes, and it went into the rubbish. See, that is in rubbish yarn. So this was a great experience. My main mechanic, because we had a machine shop in one corner where we made our parts. The machines were all European machines, both German and Swiss. They were full automatic, very modern. And so he was a good machinist and also a good machine fixer.
Especially in those days, what years about was this happening?
These were the years of 18, 19, and 20. And then we brought in another machine that was a German machine that made real heavy skating sweaters. Instead of 3 pieces, a back and 2 fronts, it made the thing in one wide piece. It was what we call a single bed. And all that had to be done was sent out. We had home workers that take that home and would knit in the sleeves, which were made on a separate machine, heavy yarn, and bring it back finished. And that cut down the cost about 40%. And that was called a shaker. That was a heavy knit. And that went on. And now while the big store was going, we had the main switchboard in the original place.
You had a telephone system even in those days.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We had a private exchange. So you had three lines. Private exchange. In the telephone directory, our name was printed in heavy block letters, and that means private exchange. See, all big companies had private exchange, and so the telephone numbers came through there, and it was switched over to 5 blocks. We had wires running through the alley. That used to cost so much a month, you know.
Yeah. And you had a total of 5 stores, I understand.
Later on, for expansion. See, there was 5 stores. Most of the additional stores were put on after I left. I was not let out. I left, why? Because Abner wasn't doing anything. He had a little money left from his settlement, and so I was very close to him, and I was very soft-hearted, and he was a terrific salesman, one of the best there was, wholesale. So we went into a new deal, making silk sweaters came in, silk, instead of wool. So we didn't knit our own goods, we didn't have that capital, so we had a firm in New York that knitted the cloth for us, see? And we would just cut and sew it. We made the patterns, and we had a wonderful line, and the Delson Knitting Mills bought stuff from us. The relationships with my father are very good. See, but we were in a different place. We were downtown, close to downtown. Then Abner was restless. You know, he had his eyes on this big store, so he wanted to also have a retail and a wholesale. So we happened to rent a place on Lincoln Avenue, which was about 5 miles northwest. So we had put up a store down on the first floor, and we had the little factory in the back. It was a deep store. Upstairs was a man manufacturing something. When his lease ran out, we took the whole building, Abner and I. And he was very restless because he was with that big company, and he had all kinds of ideas, and there was things going on, house-to-house selling with hosiery, and he wanted to establish that, and all those things. We lost a lot of money on that, but the banker that was backing us told us, boys, stick to your knitting. So we stuck to our knitting a little, but he was a fellow of fear. See, I made this great connection in the East for this silk type of stuff, and the man came down, he saw what we were doing, and he says, well, I'll tell you what. He says, you know, you stick with us, I can make you, boys. I told him that to Abner, and I said, we got to expand just what we're doing. He was fearful. He says, well, if we go with this, we'll have to incur a lot of liabilities. We have to buy all this stuff. I says, but we're going to sell this stuff. We're going to have receivables from the liabilities. You've got such good customers. You can sell the biggest people there were. But he had that fear, and he kept the brakes on. See, we had brakes, and until we dwindled out, he was afraid, fearful, very fearful. Well, the main reason for that, Sidel, who was a very fine person, but was very, very unknowing of the ways of the world, her whole focus was on Gloria, was a baby. Her whole focus was to go to Hollywood.
Yeah.
And she had a great influence on him to go to California and who he could do well. And he fell for that. And he was putting on the brakes to me. Yes, he was putting on the brakes and wouldn't expand.
She wanted to make Laurie into another Shirley Temple.
Yeah, that's the point. So he didn't say that, but that was his attitude. He didn't say that, no, because soon as he would expand, he would get involved. See? Then I made a connection with one of the biggest rayon people in the world, the Celanese Corporation of America, which is called today. But then that was called the Celanese Chemical and another company. They came from England. Dr. Dreyfus, a chemical engineer, and most of the people in the knitting trade were skeptical of artificial silk because it didn't hold up in the sewing. But they had a product, an advanced product, that rivaled silk in feel and in tensile strength. But it was hard to sell. And I had an opportunity to make a contract with them to have the distribution of the entire Middle West with our offices in Chicago and our warehouse, but they wanted a very small amount of earnest money from us. Very minuscule amount. But Abner was so tight on that, he wouldn't put it up. So naturally we couldn't make the deal. Now the contract would have been such that could, in 2-3 years, as they expanded in this country because they were backed by millions from London, our contract would have been worth millions in stock. Now, as you know, the Celanese Corporation was just taken over 2 years ago by the big Frankfurt company of, they're also chemicals and pharmaceuticals. They just took them over for something like $1,400,000,000. Hold it up.
I want to get back to the question of the origin of the name De Leon and
Yeah.
Judelson, which we heard. Judelson is supposed to be a diminutive for the Son of God, related to the word Yehuda.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
Well, it's really Judah. You know, Judah is. Now what?
About the names,
What the names?
the various names the family took as they migrated
Now,
around.
This particular of Spanish and Portuguese, Jews came up from Brazil. See, they went to Portugal, to Brazil, because that was Portugal territory. They had to leave because the Inquisition followed them in Portugal. Some went to New York, the original New York settlers there, which you have the old families like the forebears of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Cardozo, and Seixas. You'll find that in New York. And a big group went to the Caribbean, which was dominated mostly by the British, who took it away from the Spaniards. See, which today most of our British Isles are independent little islands by themselves. Of course, naturally, the British had a more liberal type of government and a more liberal type of outlook of other people, and they traded from island to island, Jamaica, see, St. Croix, and all the lesser and greater Antilles of the Caribbean. The De Leons and a big group settled in the island of Nevis. And they were engaged in the sugar plantations. Now, further, when you interviewed me further, I didn't remember all the facts, but when I went back in my mind, the De Leons got out of the actual sugar plantation, and he became an agent for a commercial agent for the group in the island Nevis, and he went traveled from there to Jamaica and all the other islands and did trading, and he was also on Nevis appointed by the English courts there as what they call a juror, see, to act in the courts. And how they changed the name to Delson is because of the English connection. There was great animosity against the Spaniards, if you remember, when for the conquering of the New World, especially the northern part. So a Spanish name didn't go too well in England, see, amongst the English. But the rest of them all kept their Spanish names, because in the cemetery, the list that was taken by an English woman who researched this in the early 1950s, and she had a whole list of all those that were buried in that cemetery. And I saw the list in a congregation that was established here, which I was a member, who's the man who ran the congregation, he ran the services. His father was the rabbi of the Portuguese-Spanish congregation on Central Park West in New York. You've maybe seen that. From the early century till about 1905. Mendes, S. Pereira Mendes. And this was this man's name. And he had all these archive books, and I used to read it because we had a little library in this temple, which I was vice president of. It was a new idea of reform. It was called the New Thought Synagogue, see, where we modernized things. And he was well educated, but he wasn't an ordained. He was a PhD in psychology. He was a psychologist. Now his great uncle, who was also named S. Pereira Mendes, was one of the clergymen that stood up in the inauguration of George Washington as president. That's in the history in New York. You'll find that. This man. And he had a plate, a big plate that we had at the entrance of our place, showed the 3 pillars of Judaism. 3 pillars, kind of Grecian pillars. I don't remember the exact words. Charity, and other 3 basic words. I'll never forget, he had that hanging there with wires. And I used to read a lot of his things, and I got a lot of information from him. In those days, I never entered my mind to go into a research and make a family history out of this. But I was surprised when I turned the page of one of the archives that he had, and I would go to a section there and tells all about a special edition, a section of the Jews of Nevis, see, and their sugar plantations, and their congregation and their cemetery. See, they had a special cemetery, and those that were buried there. And one man took it upon himself in about 1954 to go down there, and he found the cemetery there, but the stones were all obliterated, that is the slaves that were left there, they left them for the island, used that for building, but the ground was still there, and part of the stone wall, about a foot high, was still around there. And he inquired of these descendants of the slaves what was there. So they used to say to him, that was the Jew cemetery. See? And he found some parts of headstones with the names of them scraped off, written in Spanish and in Hebrew. And he got the list, and this woman, I forgot her name, she got the list from the office of the Colonial Office in London. There were all those archives there, and gave the names of the husband, the wife, the children, when they lived, and who died, and who was buried there. There was about 20 people buried in that cemetery. See, and amongst those buried, when I look down in alphabetical order, I see the name Delson. I've never seen that before associated with Spanish. Then, next to it in parentheses, it says De Leon. And it told what he did. He was a juror for the courts there in Nevis. Now, the island Nevis was only 20 miles from another island, I forgot the name of it, where the Washington family lived. And the Hamilton family were great friends of the Washington family. Alexander Hamilton, the father of the original treasury in this country, was born there.
Creator of the dollar.
And created, and was a very brilliant boy. He could not go to the established church school. See, they didn't have any public school like that. The church school, the Church of England school, because his father and mother were not married. He was born out of wedlock. So where did he attend? He attended the Jewish school. See, the synagogue ran it naturally a school. See, a regular day school and with religion. And at the age of 12, he was able to stand on a table. This was written by Mrs. Appleby. I don't know if that's their correct name, an English woman, that he recited the first 10 books of the Bible in the original Hebrew. Alexander Hamilton. Very brilliant. So later when the sugar trade dropped off account of the collapse of the world price, the Washington family moved to Virginia. See, where George Washington was born. And the Hamilton family moved also up to New York, which was an English settlement, where he went to college, and he established King's College, which became Columbia University, established by Alexander Hamilton. Now that's the story there. Now these are all authenticated by the research done by this English woman, which could be found and read about if you go to the Colonial Office in London.
When did the family then move back to Europe?
Then they moved back to Europe in the 1500s, late 1500s, around 1590 or so. See, they didn't go to the States, see, which was later called a British colony, the 13 colonies. They went to London, see, and naturally with the name of Delson, it was okay. It was very nice amongst the English, you know. They didn't use any Spanish name. Although there was a Spanish colony there. That was the first Jewish settlement where we're all coming from Spain through France and Spain.
I think that period of history there were wars between England and Spain.
Of course, you heard about the Great Armada,
yes.
where Spain was defeated, and naturally that was an anathema, a Spaniard, and.
So they changed the name back to Delson.
So they used the name Delson. That name Delson was used even in Nevis yet. See? He used that name. He was pretty sharp. His name was David Delson. And there was a David Delson throughout the generations. My uncle Dave, that's my father's, one of the younger brothers was called David. See? And that was the start. So there they went to Holland, where they settled in that community that Rembrandt always wrote about and drew most of his pictures. Most of his models of the old men were old Jewish guys with beards, see? And Spinoza lived there, and Spinoza was excommunicated from the community because he had radical ideas of Reformation. He was really what you call one of the first foundations of Reform Judaism by some of his philosophers. He was excommunicated. See, Spinoza, the great philosopher.
Yes.
And from there, you see, the kings of Poland were looking for settlements because it wasn't settled much. They didn't have much population. And most of the people were peasants, and there was nobility, what they called the boyars. And they were just lived in luxury and went hunting, and there was no one to execute and do trade with Western Europe. And because there was all of a conflict, they couldn't send their own people, so they called out, they wanted immigrants. So Germans went, and a lot of the Jewish population went from Holland, from Germany, into Poland at that time. Because they had the jobs to become distributors of the grain. They were great grain producers in Poland, but they couldn't do business because there was wars between them all. But see, the boyars figured these Jewish agents had Jewish people in Germany and France where they could sell the grain. See, that's how they did business. And that's how the population came from the west to the east. So the De Leons are at that time Delson, they went to Poland. See, in Poland, which was very religious, the orthodoxy in that time it was called Vilna, not Vilnius, but Vilna. You see, the head rabbi there was like the Pope.
Isn't that Lithuania today? Vilnius?
Vilnius they called Lithuania.
Yeah.
That time they called it Vilna because
Yeah.
Peter the Great took that over from Sweden.
Right.
When he beat Augustus Adolphus in the war, where Sweden all had that. So therefore, in the Jewish community, so they had to change their name back to the old-fashioned, without a last name. Get the idea?
Mm-hmm.
And that's how they got the Judelson. See, Judah Leib, see, Judelson, and it was translated as Judelson, Judah Leib, see, Judelson. That's how the name was got
Yeah,
it.
that's
But they kept certain forms and certain traditions in their family, and so then they migrated up to Vilna. See, they didn't go to Poland, but they went to Vilna. See, the De Leons or Delsons went to Vilna, which was very religious. It was like Rome. You know what I mean? The Gaon of Vilna was the man that interpreted the Talmud throughout the entire Jewish world. They looked at it in Spain and in Persia and all over. And you will find that in the Encyclopedia Judaica, all this in English. And you find that in the public libraries that have the set. Pete goes down there and reads a lot about it. And so therefore, that's how they changed their name, see, to Judelson. Judah Leib, Judah. They put the son on, you see. It possibly had a Lithuanian ending for son, you understand?
And the family played a big part in the cultural life there later.
Oh, naturally played. The Strassoons, who were business people, they had original patent when Sweden had control of the country. See?
And how did explain how the Strassoons were related to the Delsons?
Well, they were related because Judah Leib married Hannah Gittel Strassen. See, he was a son-in-law of one of them. One of them was a bachelor, they never married, and the other one was married and had children. There was other uncles, and he married her. See, why? Because they were big commercial people, and it was the custom of the commercial people to marry a daughter off to a scholar. See, they wouldn't take anybody if he was a tailor or a shoemaker, no matter how handsome. There was no such thing as a love. It was a match. Here was a scholar. See, he was a scholar and a wonderful singer. He was trained as a cantor. So they took him in. See, they take him in. They lived in a compound. A new daughter with a husband lived with the family. They had another house for him, a whole compound. They do that today in Italy, you know. That still goes on in Italy. And that's how he married into the Strassoon family. See? And she had brothers, and I don't know their names. They came. One of them came to America and settled in Boston, because when we lived on Crystal Street, they lived across, and she always used to say that she wants to go to visit her brother in Boston. She hadn't seen him from Europe. So the Strachan family, see, in those days, Russia was very behind in railroads. The only railroads they had coming through was maybe a main line from Moscow to Warsaw, see, and from possibly a line from Moscow to Odessa, and maybe little lines. Everything was done by horse buses. If you may have seen old engravings where they sat on the side on benches, you've possibly seen that. Well, the Stralsund were in the different transportation line. They would brought in, you see, now Russia had no outlet to the Atlantic. See, why did Italy and all those countries go to seek a new world? To get spices. See, they had no refrigerator, spices and silks from the Orient. They had to travel around all the world in ships because Russia was in the way. But Russia had these goods. Why? They transported them across the Caucasus Mountains from Persia and China by camel. And they brought camels as late as the late 1890s. Now this was reiterated in a series by the great actor Peter Ustinov. Had an 8 series on the public television about the Napoleonic Wars, and he broadcast from each particular country in Europe. And he broadcast from Lithuania, and he told about it, how they brought in the spices and the silks from China and from Persia in camels, because horses couldn't stand the strain. Camels could go a week without water. And he had the camels. See, that's our great-great-grandfather had the camels. And he had that contract and brought those things into Lithuania to the port, to the Baltic ports. See? So therefore, they had the goods, and France and England and Spain had to send ships out and send Columbus to try and discover America. They were looking for a route to the Indies. If you went to school, you remember that, to get these riches from India. So they had a monopoly on that through the shipments coming in through Vilna and the ports on the Baltic Sea. And the Stralsunds had that contract. Now, I don't know what I did with the papers. Jerry sent me one that was written in Yiddish, and he had it translated by a lady in New York or somewhere in English. And he didn't know about it. It was written really in staccato, all about that, how rich they were. So then when Peter the Great had eyes on all this, and to want to hit the West, to expand to make a liaison with the West, they made a marriage arrangement with one of the Prussian princes, German Prussian princess, I forgot her name, who later became Catherine the Great. So what did she do? She brought in Germans. She brought in Germans which is Latvia and Estonia. She skipped Lithuania, see, because that was Slavic, Poland. They didn't want anything to do with that. So they went into Estonia and Latvia, which were Letts. See, their language and their heritage was from same as Finnish, the Finns. Now you got the idea? Which was really a branch of the original Magyars who settled in Hungary. See, their language has certain words which are the same as in Hungary. For instance, the word money, pengar. See, that's one of the words I remember. So they settled a lot of Germans there as traders, and they brought in German Jews with them, traders. The whole bunch went in, Lutherans. See, the reason they didn't go into Lithuania because that was Catholic, and Prussia was Lutheran. See, Luther was a Prussian, Martin Luther. See, so they settled there, and that's the land, because the land where my mother's family settled on the estate of that Graf, which is a count. See, and they had their own pastor. My mother used to say Pastor Berg, see, German. See, so they spoke German. German was the language they used mostly amongst the tradespeople and the people that really ran the country. And the Letts, the Latvians, were mostly agricultural people. See, so whatever interest in trading was done by them. And Catherine the Great wanted an outlet for the Germans, and she was the one that started that German colony on the Volga, which today is a German-speaking ethnic group on the Volga. Now they want to go out of Russia and go into Germany now after 600 years. You may have read about that in the papers. They speak German there. See, that's quite an interesting story there. See.
Fantastic.
Now, I'll give you a little example if we digress. We had a porter that was a German from the Volga Germans by name of Gus Butz. And he brought over his brother, Hans, to America in about 1919, and he wanted to get him a job at our place. He was a tall fella, so he was talking in my father to give him a job, show how wonderful it is. He said to my father in German, no, to his brother, Hans, zeig mal the Fuß, show him the big feet you got. He thought that would show his strength. My father would give him a job. My father never gave him a job because he had no particular skills, so he got a job somewhere else. So the whole mix of the immigration here is very interesting, in Chicago especially, because it was an ethnic city. It was cities within the cities. There was a Polish district, there was a Czech district, there was a Lithuanian district, and there was an Irish district, and only people of those people lived in those districts. You see? You get the idea? And the WASPs, see, the original Anglo-Saxons lived also in the district, which was the northeast side, and in some other little districts. And that's how it was. That's where you'll go, and it was very interesting. In those days, they had what's called principal business streets, where those people never went to downtown in their life. That was a little too high tone. In there were big stores, you see, and there's tremendous. It's all down today. There's no such thing today, you know, with shopping malls and the stockyards. Now the Lithuanians were in the south side there in the stockyards, which was the biggest thing in the world. They worked in the stockyards, and of course they made good money. Compared from what they were poor peasants there. There was a big district, Ashland Avenue, and the Poles worked in the higher grade stuff. They were machinists, a lot of machine shops. See, they were better educated, and machine shops and things of that nature, and weaving and now the Czech people worked mostly in the Western Electric Company, where they made most of the world's telephones. See? Yeah.
I wish they knew how to do that today.
Yeah, they were the world's telephones were made in Cicero, which was Czech, and they worked there, which was very highly skilled. See, they lived there, highly skilled technicians, women and men. And that was called Little Bohemia. They didn't call it. There was no Czechoslovakia. There was Little Bohemia. See, the Slovaks lived in a little different neighborhood. That was a little separated from them. See, 26th Street and 22nd Street in Chicago West was the business street. See, and all the merchants, see, all the Jewish merchants were Jewish Czechs. There was Oplatka and Reinisch, and you see the name Oplatka, Edward Oplatka, and Novak and Novotny. They were all, see. In fact, I had a girlfriend from Milwaukee. Her name was Novotny, a Czech girl. Oh, she was a beautiful girl. She came to Chicago for a stage career. And I was running a beauty contest. You know, a bathing beauty contest in the vaudeville shows to advertise bathing suits. That was my girlfriend. Her name was Marie Novotny. So she changed her name, a stage name, Marie Dumont. Made it look Frenchy. I tell you what was going on, mister. It was right, it was the most interesting city in the world, highly cultured. We had in Chicago, the finest symphony orchestra in the world. You heard about the Chicago, that is Theodore Stock, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, one of the finest in the world there. See, of course, because there was very big money amongst the WASPs, you know, the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the big merchants and the original bankers. And the orchestra hall and the auditorium the only city outside of New York that had its own grand opera company, where Caruso, Mary Garden, Melba, all of them sang there and worked there. World renowned. And then each ethnic group had their own, the Czech people had what they called the Sokols, see? Athletic halls and turning. After school, the boys used to have special little costume suits and they used to go after school for gymnastics. You see.
It's a big thing still today
Yeah,
in Czechoslovakia.
the Sokols, yeah. And the Germans had a similar thing too. The Germans had, that's for you mingled with these people, and the people all were not antagonistic to each other. Everybody was friends. There was no antagonistic amongst the one group or another, not at all. It was just that was their own colony, and this is it, you know. But they'd mix in public places or anything else, and people would go and shop in district. They would go over to the Polish district and see what kind of bargains they got there. Maybe buy Polish food, buy this food. See, the only people that were what you call subjugated slightly and small in volume were the Italians, close to downtown Chicago. They were Sicilians. They weren't what you call the northern Italians. They were really the real laborers that worked on the streets, that dug the streets. You got me? The street cleaners, they were all Italians. See, poor Italian peasants. See, and they had a mafia that used to call the Black Hand. See, they used to fight amongst themselves. See, one was rich, they sent him a letter with a black hand in ink. See, if he didn't pony up money, they'd kill him. That was, they kept away. See, the Italians, no one mingled with them at all. The Sicilians. See, because there wasn't any better class of Italian there. And that was Chicago in the 19th century and the early middle 20th century. Where did we leave off at? You can stop where I'm asking you that question. Cut it off.
You stop to telling that while your brother was going to play football, that you was listening your aunt.
See, it was always on a Saturday afternoon because the people always kept the Sabbath. Nobody worked on the men worked, but the women didn't do anything, and they'd come dressed up and they drink tea. See, they drink tea with lemon and talk about their place back home. They still call it home. That's the most peculiar part. They came here to America to get away from persecution and for their sons to get away from the Russian army, and they still used to call home. They used to say in their Heim, in German, in the home, back home. And they used to talk about all these places and the towns. I knew the names. Now, in my days, most of those towns had Russian names. Now you notice that you send me a map where the names were different for the same cities, because when they got their independence after the First World War, these Baltic countries, they changed their name. See, Vilnius was called Vilna in those days. See, and when my father was born, it was called Kopcheva. Now, in the new one that you found out, the name was spelled a little different, but it was the same town. Now, you get the point, don't you?
Yes, of course they're changing names every time there's a new regime.
Yeah, changing names. So I used to hear all the stories and all the places, and they were all dressed up, the women nice. They were all nice, respectable. Their husbands were doing very good. One's husband was, he was originally came here as a tinsmith. You know, he was an apprentice as a tinsmith. They came from Estonia. And because that was the same language as Latvia. It was the same type of people. It was two countries. And then later on, he got a job as the head foreman of the American Can Company in Brazil, Indiana. He was, a great craftsman. And he made money. Then he opened up a big place in Chicago. He did very well. Then retired at a very young age and came to California and built a nice home on Poinsettia Street, if you know where that is.
Mm-hmm.
Poinsettia between Beverly and Melrose. And she was a very, very close friend of my mother. She was, I think, one of the bridesmaids at her wedding. And she was born in Estonia, in the city of Perno. See, that's a seaport in Estonia. And they were what you call, they weren't like what you call the Jews that lived in the still called it Old Lithuania, which was called the Pale of Settlement, like the city of Minsk, Pinsk, Vitebsk, and Slutsk, see, and all those cities. See, those are the people were still what you call back in the 15th century. See, the Jewish people still went the way it did 500 years ago because they were kept in the ghetto. They even dressed like that with long coats, you know, and even wore knee breeches. See, there were these sects that you see today. These people were all what you call westernized because of the German influence, and of course of the Scandinavian influence. And it was very interesting, and I used to take great interest and look up the history of that. In fact, Pete used to call me later on years ago when we were grown men his Far Eastern authority. So Catherine the Great, according to history and according to Peter Ustinov, settled these Germans in the Volga. See? And mainly, the idea was the Hohenzollern family, that was the Kaiser's family, they had their eye on the Russian plains of kind of the big plains and the wheat. See? And that's their slogan. And you remember the German slogan, the Drang nach Osten, the push to the east. You notice Germany always went to the east. See, that's why they broke up Poland, because it was grain country. See, grain and agriculture. And they wanted to conquer that. And of course, Peter the Great wanted to westernize. He went, got a job as a shipbuilder somewhere in Belgium in order to build up a navy and commercial ships out of the Baltic to get into the Atlantic Ocean. But he never achieved that. He got into the Atlantic Ocean, see, where the trade was going on. He still had to depend on bringing the goods in by camel. Now they started the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Now you wouldn't believe this, but Peter Ustinov had his statistics. Don't forget, he's of Russian extraction, of a noble family, although he was born in France. They didn't start that very late. That's practically in our days, my generation almost. 1878, the Trans-Siberian Railroad was built, see, and completed in around 1890. Went all the way from Moscow to Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. Imagine, biggest, longest railroad in the world. Now that had branches. Then they started to get all that goods in by railroad. They became a power. And of course, a lot had to do in Russia was the Russian Orthodox Church. See, they ruled everything. See, they made the Romanov family. He was head of the church, the czars, and she, Catherine, converted to the Orthodox Church. She had to convert, but she was a traitor for the church. She was we use the word womanizer. She was a man-wiser. She had lover spots.
A
Ten of them on the
manizer.
side. You know that in history.
Yeah.
So this is quite a history, those Balkan countries, the Baltic countries. It was quiet, respectable, very fine, people, and that's the situation. But of course...
Now they're in the history books again, right? Now today.
History books again. Of course the reason for leaving, being it was dominated by Russia, was the conscription. Now the conscription wasn't like today, 3-4 years. It was 27 years, the boys. They grabbed them 14, 15 years. It's 27 years in the army. Now my mother's family, all her uncles, see, her father's name was Gordon. She had 3-4 different uncles. They each had a different name. One was named Carol. One was named something else. I forgot. But different names. Why? When they were looking for Gordon, there's no Gordon here. He must have went to America. So they couldn't conscript him. So that's why a lot of them went. They didn't go for any hardship in those countries because they had a good life in the Balkan countries. See? Because
They went to avoid the army.
they went to war in the army.
That's
Because
probably
the
why
army
the
was
names were
cruel
changed.
in those days. It was
Yeah.
cruel. What did they give them to eat? Who was the heads? These guys with beautiful uniforms, the nobility, fine color. You see sometimes in the movies. This is correct. And they give them a pail of kapusta with a big round hunk of black bread. See, a whole pound. And this was the rations for the army. Once in a while on Sunday or holiday, they'd give them a piece of salt pork. The idea? Schwingen. treaty. So
Unbelievable.
that's how the immigration came. Like for instance, I tell you about this family I'm talking about. The name was Kaminsky. That came from Estonia. He was doing well. He was a tinsmith in Estonia. He wasn't married to her yet, but his family, and they had a nice life there. They mingled nice with the other people. There was no discrimination between Jews and the other people. It was a very civilized society. See, well, that was the influence of Catherine, because she wanted this to westernize that. She wanted it as a link, and so naturally, all had to beat it to come to the army. See? Some were taken, and then they had what you call a lot of traitors amongst the Jews. They used to pay so much if they would kidnap a 16-year-old Jewish boy on the street, kidnap him right off the street before he went home, and bring him over to this subscription, what do you call the induction station, induct him in the army, and they get so much ahead.
Do you think that had to do with why your family left there, because of the army? Or?
Well, they left there. No, they left there because the pogrom was going to start. When Alexander the Stone, so I don't remember the second or the first was assassinated somewhere down in Middle Russia by some anarchists. See, so they had to appease the people, you know, because the ordinary Russian peasant looked at the Tsar as possibly like he looked at God. See, he was the agent of God. You get the idea? He was head of the Russian church. See, he was the head of the Russian church, and so what did they used to say? Well, we're going to have a pogrom. There was all these Jewish fellas that they made this plot to kill Alexander the Second. I think it was some guy threw a bomb on his carriage on a parade somewhere in southwestern Russia. So they saw the pogrom was coming on, and they started to arrest him. My uncle Albert, as I told you in the story, was taken out of the cemetery, and they was marched back to Poland on foot. And they were building a road, you know. The prisoners used to chop small ones out of big ones, you know, little fine stones to build a road. In bare feet, they made them travel in chains and leg chains back to Poland, see, because they settled in Poland in that time. So then they figured the time the people were blowing out, let's blow out of here. Because northern Poland was divided after the Napoleonic Wars between Russia, Austria, and Germany. See, northern Poland, including Warsaw, was part of Russia. Southern part with Krakow and outside it was Austrian. See, where they made it speak German, they spoke German, and Austria was more westernized. They had schools there, and then Slovenia and Bohemia was also part of Austria. There you had your German influence there. And so that's why they were the big exodus was in those days in the 1880s, 1890s, and then it was quiet for a while, and there was a new pogrom in 1904 after the Russo-Japanese War. So they blamed the Jews. The Russians lost the Japanese War. So we had a carpenter who was helped building the fixtures in one of our stores. He was in the Russian army at the Japanese-Russian War, and he was there at Port Arthur when 1 million Russian soldiers surrendered to about 100,000 Japanese. Why did they surrender? Now this is the truth. The bullets didn't have gunpowder, but they had sawdust in there. The graft was so big, the graft and inefficiency of the Russian system, that in each district they had a polkovnik. You know what a polkovnik is? A colonel. He was in charge of the munition factories, and he used to get graft from the munition manufacturer. Instead of putting gunpowder, they put sawdust and sand in. When they started to shoot, it wouldn't go.
So I guess the communists didn't invent corruption and inefficiency.
No, this was truth. This was the truth. So they were surrendered. 1 million soldiers surrendered to the Japanese at Port Arthur, which is today I think called Harbin.
Incredible.
Right back to Harbin, Manchuria. So he was telling me all about it. He was a corporal in the Russian army. Yeah. He told me they broke open the bullets. No put gunpowder, but sawdust. So that's why the big immigration came as kind of the pogroms, or the threat of a pogrom coming. They slipped out before the pogrom started, and I don't know if the pogrom ever actually happened up in that part of the country. I don't know, but there was one, a serious one in 1905, because they lost the Japanese-Russian War,
Did they go directly to America, or did they go by way
No,
of
they went to England.
England?
They went to England. See, they went to England. Yeah. They went to Hull, England. See. Now you see, there's one point where Jerry has the wrong dope. He got it from the grandchildren among Clower. You know, it's a third generation that only heard, didn't know anything, never entered much family life, kind of heard. Like the whole family came together in New York. My father never saw New York until he was a grown adult, until he was well established in the Delta Knitting Mills, and he went to New York for business. He was a man about 44 years old, the first time he ever was in New York. He came via Canada, see, from Hull, England. The whole bunch were there, the whole family, the 6 sons, the father and mother, and some other townspeople, like I gave you the word Fievel for Frank Wilson. Fievel was wrong, his name was Fischel. See, it came back to me later, so we can correct that. And so he had the 6 sons, and they had a choir. See, being in Canada, so they went from the small towns to small towns. Hull, York, England, and just north of Hull is another port. Hull was a bigger port on the North Sea, and that's how they made their living. They had their own troupe, see, just like a theatrical troupe. They all had wonderful voices. They're all very musically inclined, and they knew what you call the basics of music. They studied, you know, what you call, we would say, when people take courses in music appreciation and all that. So my Uncle Albert and Uncle Morris, the 2 older ones, with their wives, young brides and grooms, went to Canada. See, they heard there was some family that they knew that emigrated there a long time ago, and they took them in, and they established themselves a little. And then my father himself, with his friend Fievel, or Frank Wilson, who changed his name when he got in Canada. He was a tall, blonde guy. So he looked like a typical Englishman with blue eyes. And they went there and joined them. My cousin Rose and my cousin Helen were born in Toronto. Jerry has that she was born in Troy, New York. This is not true. She got that third hand from a great-granddaughter, you know, that heard from another, you know, something that, because my uncle worked in Detroit at as a fill-in rabbi. You know, he was ordained with his papers. You know, he had the papers from this great seminary of Grodno, see. So my father was a blonde, blue-eyed guy and spoke, I don't know how he picked up, he picked up the English in Hull. He spoke almost like a Cockney. He didn't pronounce his H's for a while. My mother used to kid him about not pronouncing his H's. He put an H where it didn't belong. And he overcame that habit. So he got himself as a job as a cash boy in Eaton's department store at 16 and a half years old. A cash boy was so. A clerk was waiting on a lady, and she says, "I'll take this yards of goods." So she'd say, "Cash boy." Cash boy would run over, take that in the cash, and run over to a booth where they took the cash, and come back with the package change and give it to the customer. He worked for Eaton's for a while, so he quit that job, and then he got a job. They were paving the streets in Toronto, and they paved them with wooden blocks made out of trees of equal circumference. There was plenty of forests in Canada, still is. Wooden blocks about 8 inches tall, all uniform, and in between they pour fine pebbles with tar. It made the most beautiful street. It was quiet. When the horses went, you couldn't hear it on Yonge Street. He got a job doing that, carrying the wooden blocks to the builders. Well, he got tired of that. That was no job for a fellow that had an education like him. So he hooked up with a wholesaler, and says, and just a little north there, the Indians, you know, the Indians in Canada were not treated like the Americans treated the American Indians. They were treated with very fine, civilized manner. Their territory was respected. They were taken care of, and they were hunting. They were hunting for furs, fur trade. And they gave him a credit with a big sack of. Hello. They were shooting now. It's going to be in eight seconds. It'll be in 8 seconds. Yeah. 8 months. I don't know. When do you be through that bill? Past 11.
Well, it's up to you, Eli, however long your strength
Well,
holds
it's up
out.
to me how long we can get through with some of this epic here. He'll call you back. Yeah, he'll call you. Yeah. See, this is a great epic. All right, you ready to go?
Right.
So he rented a little horse and a little wagon to put in pots, pans, yard goods, and all things from the city, and went into the wilds of Ontario, where there was Indians living, in wigwams, nice Indians. And he traded with them, see. Only thing he was not allowed to take was whiskey, that was against the law. And but all kinds of goods, just stuff like candy and stuff like that. And he made great friends with Indians. In fact, we had a photograph sitting in the wigwam with the Indians, and it was well preserved. I don't know, the pictures in those days hold their preservation, and the new pictures today don't. Now, we had that for years, but Midge, your mother, geez, I hope she doesn't listen to this, Jean and Martha had a fad about 7, 8 years ago, or before he was married, to put all these old Gay 90 pictures on the walls.
Don and Martha.
Martha.
Yeah, Don and Martha.
Don and Martha.
Yeah.
Don and Martha. And anything they got, they destroyed. They left it or didn't have value. I said, you must bring those pictures. They never brought them back. Pictures that were taken by my mother, my father in 1890, 99. But that one picture of my father, a young man with blonde hair, sitting with the Indians. So never got that picture back. I said, where is it? They don't know that. Martha was a wonderful kid, a good kid, but so negligent. Had no respect for anything in the house. Once she tore up a carpet, she thought, I hope you don't register this. So he mingled with the Indians, and they taught him how to shoot a rifle, how to knock down a wild goose or a wild duck, And he was telling me a story how they used to prepare a wild duck. See, that used to come and migrate from the tropics to the Arctic Circle. They would they would open it up, clean out the insides, and they take with the feathers and all with clay. See, cover with clay, and they built a fire in the ground, and was well roasted. They'd break the clay, and the feathers would all stick to the clay, and there was the duck already roasted. See? He was telling me that story. And when he came for Europe, he was a marvelous swimmer. That he was. That he knew. But they taught him how to shoot. And he was a terrific marksman. And I never knew that until I was about 26 years old. I never knew that he could shoot. Never mentioned anything. I told this story in our original version. Abner and I came walking from his store. We were coming home. We moved to North Avenue from Crystal Street. And it was a shooting gallery. They said, let's stop off here. And he says, well, shoot. Abner and I looked at each other. He picks up the rifle. The guy and the ducks were going slowly. He was knocking them off one after another.
Fantastic. I had no idea my grandfather could shoot a rifle.
Oh, he was actually an excellent shot. In fact, when he first came to Chicago, he got a job as a salesman and a stock boy with a family by the name of Frank, Louis Frank, German people. And he slept in back of the store. First of all, gave him, and also to be like a watchman. He had a gun. And once they tried to rob the place, and he shot that gun, bang, bang, and the burglars ran away. See, because Louis Frank himself, the owner, who was an older man than my father, told me the story when he came over to visit us on our Milwaukee Avenue store. He came to visit, he congratulated my father for the big place he had. And now the coincidence is how the world revolves like in the soap operas. One of Jerry's sisters, see, one of my cousins, see, married a son of this very Frank. See, they built up later on a very big department store in the South Side Chicago, Frank's department store. one of Jerry's sisters married one of his friends. Isn't that funny?
Fantastic.
It's a fantastic story. Believe me, it's fantastic.
All our lives are full of incredible coincidences.
Incredible coincidences. Now you have that. Now, how far do you want to go now? I told you we moved from Crystal Street to North Avenue, which was close. This was the German section, bisected by Milwaukee Avenue. And the streets around there, south of us, they had some very fine homes. The Uline family, who owned the Schlitz Brewery in Chicago, lived there. They had a half a block, and they had a hot house, a big flower conservatory with the rock gardens and fountains on that street. It was called Pierce Avenue.
Are there any details about your family life on Crystal Street?
Oh, yes.
That would be
Well, I
interesting.
told you about Crystal. I got that whole thing. Have you got a copy of it?
Of course I have, but to have you tell it to us live on
Well,
camera.
Well, I don't remember all the exact details. It would take an hour. He says you got to be there, Bill.
So I think you're probably getting tired by now. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm
A lot
not
of
exactly
wonderful
tired, but I can't. I gave you full detail. I'd like if you could
I'll send you a copy.
put it in the same spot. Now that must be the poltergeist that stole it.
Yeah, probably. I have it all on my computer, so I can print up a new copy. And
That
send
was
it
a
to you.
wonderful story. Now this was, well, I can tell you, continue. We moved to North Avenue, and the life was continued. You got it on? Only it was a little different. We were older. We were teenagers.
Mhm.
See, we weren't any more grammar school kids. Abner was older than I. Already he had older boys and he had girlfriends, and I was going to high school. And but the house was kept the same. The various decorum of eating, and the reason we moved close because we opened the retail. See, before he was only a wholesaler. He was a contractor.
Mhm.
He had a contracting for big distributors, and so he had this building built for him. There was an old wooden house, and the man built it to his specifications. He had a long lease, so we figured he'd sell direct, have a factory there. I mean, a store. So being close to the store, and he wouldn't have to have public transportation, which is very close and good in Chicago. So he'd walk. He could come home in the evening earlier. So our life was kept up, but it wasn't quite as particular as it was when we were younger. But yet it was just as formal. See, no one could just grab it and bite and eat when he wanted it. Dinner was served at this hour, and that was it. You get the idea?
I think I'll join you in the picture now.
Yeah. Now I'm joined by the great producer, Mr. Gene Weitz of
Yes, you
Prague,
remember me.
Czechoslovakia. You see.
And
And
this is really such a fantastic story. I don't understand how you can do it. You just go on and on telling one interesting fact.
yeah, you see, I pulled my right ear, you see. and I'll tell you where I learned that. See, the course I took in the laws of biogenesis
Yeah.
under Professor J. Howard Moore.
Yeah.
See, he was a Scotsman, and he was telling about the cerebellum of the brain, which is a recording. See, the original recording machines, these scientists got that. It's recorded in that particular cells of the brain.
World's greatest computer right here.
It never leaves you. You may forget it, but certain incidents, and Professor Metchnikoff, who took over from Pasteur, was a great exponent of this, see, of this. And I was very much involved in that study, see. So I knew that was it, so I used to kid people. How do you remember? I said I'd pull my right ear, and that would give me the clue. Like you press a button on the computer.
All the information.
All the information.
It's fantastic. Well, it's really great listening to these stories.
So, you see, we went on for about 4 years. Everything was beautiful until this involvement with this other woman started. And then he didn't come home for lunch, and then he didn't come home for dinner. You understand? On time. Yes, he was supposed to be working, and then it started. See, then it started with Abner outs with him, and I was still going to school, and at high school at that time, and our formality broke up to a degree, see. We ate mostly dinner, my mother, father, Midge, Abner, I, and Pete. My grandmother, my mother still with us that time. She was a wonderful, my mother was a wonderful baker, wonderful cook, but my grandmother was a wonderful cook. She could make home noodles and chop as fine. You think she'd cut a finger like a chef, noodles for noodles soup. See, and it was a great life. And then we were older, and we saw the antagonism going on. So Abner and I said, we ought to move away from here. We're too close to the business. So we moved over to Humboldt Boulevard, which was a very rich street. It was as wide as the Champs-Élysées. It ran from Humboldt Park into Palmer Square. In the center was a large driveway where automobiles were going in. On each side was a lane. There was no through traffic, but just a lane, street to get into the houses and apartments. See, and on each side, east and west, the street ran north and south in the center. And between was grass, a garden on each side. It was as wider than the Champs-Élysées, that Humboldt Boulevard. Beautiful street. So we found a fine apartment.
Chicago sometime. I don't really know.
We had a wonderful apartment there, and it was modern. It was a new house. It was just built in 1906, so it had all the latest thing. The dining room was beamed, fumed oak, with in each corner was electric light and a china cabinet with lights in it, and they had more than one bathroom. It was a marvelous place.
And when was it built?
1906.
So it was modern.
It was real modern. See now, and Crystal Street was near modern. It was built in 1909, but it wasn't as high grade a building, This was high grade building, six apartments, 3 stories.
Was it normal then to have electric lights? I guess it's.
Oh, it was coming on gradually. None of them did. It still had with gas mantles. They give great light. That was a knitted thing built in a chemical, and give a great light. And it was a wonderful place.
And you had telephone at home?
We had a telephone. We were the only ones that had a telephone on Crystal Street. Later on, most people had telephones. I still remember the numbers. Humboldt 5446. So we moved there, and naturally, that's when the breakup came. Come home late, never come home dinner, couldn't come dinner because the salesman was in from New York, all kinds of excuses. And then the wrangle started. See, so we lived there, and
what was the antagonism between your brothers and your father? Is that the idea?
no antagonism between Abner and him. See, but yet they were on talking terms and everything. Very good terms. He became emotionally involved, so emotionally involved in the whole thing, you see. And his makeup was different, He took it so to heart, you see. And I took it to say, well, things will work out somewhere or other. There's nothing to raise so much hell about it, you know what I mean? And
so where did you move to?
We stayed at 1933 Humboldt Boulevard. We stayed there for a couple of years, and it was a very big place. And being that Pete was going to go to college, why do we need such a big place? So we moved on the same street, a block down across the street. Also a new building, but a smaller apartment. See, which was plenty, a smaller apartment. This was a great big place. And there was Midge, myself, and my mother. Pete was down in Champaign, Illinois, to college. See? And we had a great big front porch that was all screened in. See? And then everything was calm. See, everything was calm there, you see, because there was no corridors. Everything was running smooth. See, he was away, and only except something would flare up once in a while, someone seen him with her at a restaurant, and so then when things were going big, the new store, we incorporated. First we were a corporation, and then we were enlarged in corporation, and I was made vice president, and because I knew the business and I ran the factory and the little store downstairs, and the main thing was to have me there. See, my mother wouldn't let me leave there because if I leave there, she'd be alienated from him entirely. See, I was the liaison. See, and I was what you call the fall guy. See, in other words, the pawn. He wouldn't have to live with me. Oh, and he gave me the best job. See, and every Sunday he'd take me to the opera. You see, and with the rest of his family, my uncles, you see, to show that his family.
This was the time that Alex was involved with this woman at the factory?
Yeah. And so I had a job there, a big job with big money, with a company car.
That was something, a company car?
Company car. Yeah, company car.
What kind of a car was it?
A Dodge. A touring car. Those days it was called a touring car. A closed car like we got today was called a limousine. And everything was called a limousine.
Yes. In Europe they still use that term.
the limousine. And so it was a wonderful life, you see. And my mother was very calm then because nothing was going on. You know, he was very quiet. There was no suits going on. All right, let him go. Just as, and the checks were coming in for her. You know, by the agreement of the lawyer, checks were coming here for the house to take care of Midge and Pete.
So she didn't seem to be outwardly upset.
Well, she was upset. She still had in mind, still figuring something will calm down. And once in a while, things just flare up. Once in a while, but just by herself, you know. And my uncles were much involved to see that she had a social life, you know, always having parties. They were great social people, always having parties, always feeding relatives, you know, big parties. They used to cook six kinds of meat at a party. Great eaters, you know. They were Latvians, you know. And
we were watching the tape with Jackie Mason. You see this tape? He's already talking about the Jewish people have that plenty to eat.
Yeah, they're eating. And of course, they were, you see, they were very Americanized, you see. But they were great eaters. They were tall, great, big people, you know. And 6 feet, 4, some of them, you know.
Alex wasn't very big.
Who? No, I'm not talking about my father. I'm talking about my mother's family.
Oh,
my mother.
They were big.
Her mother's intermarried family. You know, the Fritschals. Their name was Fritschal, the German name. They were all tall guys, you know, big. One of them was a soldier in the Spanish-American War, you know. But they were great eaters. They could eat. You see, there was nothing. What do we have tonight? We'll have lamb. No, they had lamb. They had beef. They had chicken. All that was. You could have your choice. You see, big tables. My God, what cooking was going on always. And
before diet food.
Yeah. And naturally, it costed money. Those people made big money. They spent the money on food. And they always had relatives over, a bunch of relatives, maybe 6, 10, 14 people at the table. You know.
Speaking of food, I think we're going to all have to go out and have some lunch pretty soon. You must be pretty tired from
No, I'm not tired.
Really?
No, I'm not tired. I eat lunch.
Tell me when you are.
And that's how we evolved from Crystal Street to North Avenue to Humboldt Boulevard. See? And then Abner got this big job. He became the general sales manager of Victor Manufacturing Gasket Company, the largest manufacturer of automotive gaskets in the world. Big plant. There were 4 Polish brothers. 3 of them were just mechanics, and the older one was a man that educated himself, and he was a very shrewd and very fine man. And he liked Abner because Abner taught him a lot of things of social amenities. And he joined, naturally such a big manufacturer, the Union League Club, which was a WASP club. She used to take Abner there for lunch with him, you know. And he was a young guy, only 23, 4 years old, you know. General sales manager for such a big company, see. And he was a terrific salesman. He used to go to Detroit continually, from Chicago to Detroit. And when he bought a car, I was in charge of his car. So he used to park in front of our place because where he lived on a regular street, you know. He didn't want to leave it park on the street there, it was a streetcar, I think. And ours was a private driveway along the main Plaisance, you know. And I used to use his car. See, he bought a Buick, a big car, a green one. Sidell wouldn't buy a Dodge, you know. See, that was for her, you know. She wanted. She was showing off for her girlfriends, which were all poor girls from the ghetto. See, and she moved up to this higher place, and she wasn't very well educated at all. You know.
This was typical of Sidell. I mean, she was always upwardly mobile.
Upwardly mobile. So the car was left for me, so I'd use the car. See, I'd call on the dames and drive up with this big 6-cylinder Buick all the time instead of the Dodge. It was quite a thing going on.
The Abner was traveled by train.
By train, oh yeah, train. Used to take the Motor City Special. It's a very fine train. You know, there's nothing that spared money on the travel, you know. And I went with him once to Detroit on I had a vacation, and we stayed in the finest hotel, and I took a tour to the Ford factory. I went with him to Ford while he'd come back with a big contract of $250,000 in one shot, you know, for gaskets. And I went through the whole plant with the tour. With the whole tour, they used to take tours. That production line.
That must have been really interesting.
Oh, that was interesting. Yeah.
That was a sensation.
That was interesting. So then he wanted to get out of the contract, see, because the boys from the Union League Club, what do you want with that little Jew boy? For God's sakes, how can you even allow to bring him in here? So he hated to do that. He really broke down. So he settled with him. He got a big cash settlement. So that was in the books. And didn't do any for Wiley. Wiley wanted to establish a plant making some kind of automobile accessory because he knew everybody in the business from coast to coast. And so it didn't work out. He had a little factory. Then he figured we'd go back into the knit goods business. So I figured, well, it was kind of a panic and then after the First World War. And so I said, well, I think I'll leave because I'm an expense there and the lease was up on the small store with the factory. The lease was up there, going to move it somewhere. So I'll leave. I thought, well, I'll leave and cut down the expense. And you just run the big store there. The factory was moving to another place, but they never put it up. They put it up, but they never ran it. And so Abbott and I went in and went into the manufacturing of the silk sweaters, which came in, silk and rayon, which we bought the cloth. And it was a very small capital. We established a bank credit. We were close to downtown in an old-fashioned building that was built right after the Chicago fire, the Olympic Theater, the Haymarket Theater building. And I did the cutting. We had a couple of sewing machines, and Abbott was a terrific salesman, got big orders. We made money, and then he saw this place on Lincoln Avenue, northeast side, a big business street, big department stores, especially stores. There was a building built similar to our original place on Mohawk Avenue, upstairs and down. Well, there was a guy upstairs making paper novelties, and he had the lease, but the downstairs store guy moved out, and he would rent us the bottom, the downstairs. Guy by the name of Raleigh Horn. So we gone in there. We had this guy build us fixtures. Someone recommended him. The guy he was from Slavonia, Slovak. Built a nice fixtures, a nice fellow. Built nice fixtures for us, and in the back we built our little factory, making the silks for sewing the sweaters.
You're doing so well. It's a pity that you left. It was because of
Well,
Sedell, you said.
Sedell, see, was he had such a I don't know, it was fear, and she talked him in, and he kept the brakes on because he wouldn't expand because he couldn't go to California to go to she was only a baby then. So how could he involve himself? How could he commit himself to expand and keep the business going? Gave up the Celanese proposition. So then, after this big wrangle where
Especially in the mid-20s, because Gloria's about the same age as
yeah,
now.
the mid-20s. She was a young, I think she's maybe a year older or a year younger. I don't know what it is. She was a young kid than a baby. I think she was a year younger. But she was in some silent picture where she crawled on the grass. I went to see it. So there's all kinds of opportunities. So his excuse was, will incur liability. We were very financially sound in a small way, small. We had bank credit. So he just put the blocks. So your father Joe was manager of a big store downtown. He was doing well. He was a good salesman, had a good appearance. His life was okay, regardless of what beach talks. And so naturally, when my mother started that biggest ruckus, see, when she happened to look out of the window and moved to a very fine place on Wellington that was close to Lincoln Park, you see, because I had the business and she was getting more money from him.
I had no idea my father was a manager of the store.
Yeah, he was manager of the store. Oh, he was always a good-looking, dressed nice, and he was he was a very good salesman. And he was manager of that big store right on the corner of State Street. That was on Broadway and 7th. And so that court order against us, where we used the name Delson Sweaters, and his was Delson anyway. So we were enjoined by the court to take the name Delson off.
You couldn't even use your own name.
No, because it was registered trademark. It was special judge in chancery, and it used to cost us in those days $90 a day for that trial, with a corporate reporter and thing. So we settled, and we changed the name. We called it Duro Sweaters. So then that put Abner. Right away he's going to leave. See, didn't tell me. He already made plans to leave. You see, he got involved with Sedell's uncle, who was a lithographer, and he was going to make pasters that goes on orange crates, and Abner was going to be salesman, and they come to all of a sudden they were involved, they never had a dime, you see. And a cousin of mine that was here got him into the dress business as a salesman, and I left with, so your father and I and Pete, we got an apartment, the three of us, you see, a big apartment, furnished apartment, and Pete left with your father, you see, left me alone in Chicago, and I liquidated everything. They left everything to me, and you see, we went into some real estate deal, and it was, which we only had a lease, we didn't own the building, a 5-story building, I managed the place, and Abner managed the store, and he just liquidated the thing to nothing, didn't buy any goods, you understand? And when I got in and left that hotel, which I was partners with a third man, the corporation, there was nothing to sell. Liquidated the whole thing. Liquidated the whole
Then what
thing.
could you do after that?
All I could do was take the stuff and call in got the lawyer, call in the creditors. I said, listen, you take the thing and liquidate the thing and pay off the creditors. And I walked out without a dime except a few dollars cash that I had in my pocket, about $700.
And then did you go to California then?
Yeah, I came about 2-3 months later all by myself. But don't forget it, it's down, I went deluxe. I went deluxe on the California Limited.
I have to see if we have any more tape.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still are, but I
Well, I'll
think
tell
maybe
you.
we better end now.
So I left for California. I sat in the dining car, it was 8 o'clock, looked out the window, there was 2 beautiful girls, and relatives come with big bouquets of flowers, they're going to California, was like people going to the moon. Who went to California? You know, people, millionaires, went to California for the winter, you know, or maybe some people that were, I says, this is my meat. So they came in, I got acquainted with them. One of them was a daughter of one of the biggest lumber companies in Chicago. Ruth Hackett was her name. I still have the notebook. The other, I forgot it. I looked over the notebook the other day, I found the act. Got acquainted with them. It was 3 nights and 2 days, or 2 days and 3 nights. I don't know what it was. It was a deluxe fast train. And we raised hell on that train. Well, we needed another guy for the other girl. Well, there was all older people. There was a young guy, about 19 years old, very bashful. I got a hold of him, and I fixed him up. I said, this is your girl. And he was so bashful. She was about 4 years older than she was about 23. A very sophisticated dame, you know, from very rich families. What a time we had sitting there in that dining room with the deluxe meals, you know, and sitting on the observation couch. I said to myself, this is the last. I said, this is the last of the good life. And that was the last of the good life.
You're right. Riding on trains in those days, and from then on it was hard times.
It was hard times coming, and there was no opportunities here at all in Los Angeles at that time. No opportunities of any kind. Couldn't get a job. Couldn't get a job any kind. Someplace if you give them $500, they'd give you a job. You say, why do you want the $500? Well, you learn our business and then you'll quit. See, it's cost us money to teach you. Everything was a racket here. When he found out that I knew her when she first came to Hollywood and worked in her first picture, and I used to go up to their house. He was eating dinner there because he and his mother didn't have any money. They were old actors from way back, and I would have dessert and coffee with them. In the evening, I would walk down Hollywood Boulevard holding hands with her. When this man found that out, he was so elated. And he come down and gave me this poster. He had 2. That was just last week that he put it up.
It's great.
All right, ready?
Yep.
After arriving in Los Angeles for the first time, we went over to my mother's house where Pete was staying. There was my mother, Pete and I, and Midge and Joe, that's your father, and you and Jim lived just about a half a block in a nice little place where there was a small park. And so the first night we all got acquainted with each other, and the girls that I met on the train, which I've said before on this film, you got that, right?
Yes.
Come over tonight. We're going to rent an apartment, a furnished apartment. This was on West Sunset Boulevard, which was very fashionable way back in 1928. And I said, yes, I'll come over. So I came over that evening, and they said, well, I think we should go to the Montmartre, which was the meeting place of all the stars and all the high pocket people that came to Hollywood as tourists. They always had a name band and singers, and it was very fine. So I sold the girls. I said, well, you know, I have no money. I'm practically flat. She said, oh, that makes no difference. So one of them says, here, you take this money. There was a bunch of $20 bills, and I want you to pay because it doesn't look nice if we pay for you, see. They wanted to save face for me. They liked me very much. So we went up there, and it was crowded. Nice people were dancing. And in a table not far from me, was a couple, a man and his wife, and a very distinguished gentleman. And as we were eating and drinking, the man who was with his wife comes over and introduces himself. I'm Mr. Klein, Vice President of the May Company, in charge of all the shoes. This gentleman is Mr. So-and-so, I forgot his name, President of the United States Shoe Company, the biggest shoe company in America. He's taking us out because we're such a big customer, and he sees there's two girls. He says, bring the two over and we'll each have a girl. So I said, sure, that's fine. So we went over and I slipped back the money to the girl, and we went and sat down, and we had a wonderful time. We ate and we drank and we danced, and we got out of there 3 o'clock in the morning. So I was only in Los Angeles, I think, about 36 hours, and that was kind of new to me, the whole thing. And it was a small city. There was no taxis. They said there's no taxis running at all anymore because they had very little taxis. Even downtown from the railroad station to the Biltmore was possibly a taxi run. So I said, I can't. So they says, oh, come on over to our place. We'll put you up. Come to our apartment. You can stay overnight. Stay with us. We'll all have breakfast together. See? Gina's a wonderful cook. That was one of the other girls. She said, well, I can't stay because I'm only here a short time. My mother don't know where I am. My mother was very, very curious about where we are, even though we were grown men. So I started to walk. I walked down Sunset Boulevard and kept walking and walking. I knew there's a junction where Sunset Boulevard turns south and runs into downtown. No doubt, Mr. Gene, you're acquainted with that. As I kept walking, as I turned the junction, a little Model T Ford drives up with an old man. He says, where are you going? I told him I'm getting off at Silver Lake Boulevard there, Vendome. He says, well, I'm going down, I work in the produce market, which opens up 4 o'clock in the morning. He says, jump in. I was very fortunate because I was pretty tired by this time. It's about 6 miles. So I jumped in the car, and he dropped me off just about 4 houses from the street, got in, opened the door, and undressed and hopped into the hay. That's where we let go.
Right. So go on.
Now what's further?
Well,
Well, after that, the thing was to get our bearings in Los Angeles. A cousin of ours who was managing a store for an uncle-in-law who had a chain of general stores in the small towns told us to come over. There was a man staying in a hotel in that town of Monrovia who owned a big knitting mill in Seattle. Well, he introduced us to this man and told him to give us the line of goods to be represented in California. He had no representation, so we agreed. And we waited for the samples, and that's how we got started a little to cover the territory with this line of men's and boys' sweaters. It was very good quality line. The name was Burson Knitting Mills of Seattle. A few days, we started to go out, and there was a question of a car. We had money. I came with a little money. Pete had a little money. And your father found a place that had used cars. He had a car, an Essex. It ran good, a nice Essex for $75. So we bought it. And we put the
I remember that Essex. He registered in my name for some reason to save
Well,
taxes.
he bought it.
I remember it. Yeah, it's true.
And so we went out and we started to cover the territory. We hit new cities and towns around the LA area that we never saw or knew before. Where's my hat?
Up
Yes.
there, Jim put it back where it was.
No, it's a white hat.
Yes,
That's
it's
it.
behind this blue one.
There it is.
And so it was very new to us to see these different cities and towns throughout California. We started out first to go east towards San Bernardino. And from there we made Redlands and other cities, Pomona, and we started to get acquainted with the merchants, and it took us a week or so, and we started to do business. And then we mapped out other routes. We worked the stores downtown, and Pete had a line that was shipped from him from Indiana of little boys' playwear, and that's we kept going. And eventually we went as far north as San Luis Obispo. We savored the beauty of the country and the mountains and the valleys, which was so new to us coming from flat Chicago. And we worked at that quite a while. And this was the year 1928, and just the first part of 29. And of course, the Depression kept coming around. And there wasn't enough income for both of us. That is, Pete and I, to keep on my mother, because right at that time, the checks from Chicago from my mother started to stop. And of course, we would be in pretty bad financial straits. So in one of the stores, I met a man who was a manufacturer of men's underwear, shorts in cotton cloth. And I started to talk to him, and I found out that I knew his brother who had a hat store in Des Moines, Iowa, because I made that territory once for my father. So he told me that they needed a knitted shirt, but he didn't know how to put this thing together. So I says, well, I'm your man. So I left Pete alone with the lines of the sweaters and the other stuff. And in a couple of weeks, I went to work with him. And I started in his factory getting things lined up. First, I started as a cutter to cut the stuff. Then he saw that I wasn't what you call just what they call a working stiff. So he made me foreman, manager. He started me out with $35, and he says, a fellow like you should earn more. Next week you'll get $50 a week, which was fairly good money in those days. Especially out here, things were very cheap. A delicatessen on Temple Street, which was near downtown, was the center. You could buy 2 corned beef sandwiches for 25 cents in those days. Things were very cheap.
We paid about $5.50 yesterday.
Yeah, but they weren't as big as they are today. They weren't as thickly plastered as they are today. So I worked with him, and I told him what new machine he'll have to get to assemble these things, which we did. It was very expensive. And so we put it in, and he got the goods, the knitted goods, rayon, and we started, so he had a better line. And I worked with him for over a year and a half, and as the depression got worse and worse, although he was kept going because he was a wonderful salesman, he was well known in the territory, but he had a brother-in-law. There was a very close family that was out of work, a man with children. So he says, the family decided you've got to give him work. So he says there was no other place to put him. He brought him in, and I taught him how to cut, and he says, I'll have to leave, you go. So I was out of a job. So meanwhile, Pete was selling this stuff, and that started to peter out. So then Pete was selling advertising for Jerry Delson's father, who had a patented letterhead, and he did quite well. He sold banks and savings and loans. It was called Central Phone and Central Fold. He had his stuff printed here, and he was paid for it, and he got a big commission for selling it. I went around trying to get something I couldn't, and then one outfit, a salesman that used to sell men's shirts, had a friend that had a factory that was making accessories for pants manufacturers, and he talked him in to open a factory making shorts and pajamas, because this place was the only place making this type of stuff in California. So he says, well, I've got the man that'll run your factory, and I know him. So he brought me up there, and so they hired me. So I got that job. Things were going bad, so the most they would give me was $40. I'll take it. So I took $40 a week. Okay? And Pete was earning, so we had a nice place for ourselves close to downtown. And we bought a car, a little Chevrolet, one of those little new Chevrolets with a little trunk in back. It had red wheels, and we were going very nice between us. But there was no income coming from mother, so naturally, a good percentage of our money we had to support her in Chicago. See? So, but otherwise, we were all right. We were buying some clothes, and we would go out to dinner Sunday with Abner and another couple that was in the show business, and everything was running very nice. Until, of course, it got worse. The depression was coming on, and so another thing happened in this place where I was. Some friend of the family, a man who was a very experienced man in this particular line of cotton goods cutting, a family man, was out of work, and they had to give him a job. So naturally they had to let me go. See? So they let me go on that, so I was out of a job. Again. So things were going pretty bad for Pete too. Banks were closing, some were failing. So Pete worked a little doing accounting, book keeping for various dress stores on Hollywood Boulevard. Some places for $5 a week, some places for $5 a month. Whatever we could scratch. So we took a little single apartment, Hollywood Boulevard, furnished, which was very reasonable, very nice. And things got worse and worse. So in those days there was no wash and wear, so we had a Chinese laundryman, and we'd give him shirts. He would let you take out one shirt at a time, see, for 10 cents for washing and ironing beautiful shirts. So that's how everybody cooperated. Nobody was in those days excited. Nobody was mean to each other. Everybody was kind of happy in the Depression.
That's interesting.
See? And the main entertainment was to walk down Hollywood Boulevard at night. See? And my friend, Gary Owen, who was a stage actor, a big stage actor, I got acquainted with him somehow. He was a friend of Abner's partner. Abner, meanwhile, opened up a place, being a representative of ladies' dresses of New York outfit, where they carry the stock on hand, with a friend from Chicago by name of Yale Schamberg. He put up most of the money. See, he had some money left from Chicago because he was in partners at a drugstore, and he had a lot of jewelry that he accumulated with his wife, hocked the diamond ring, and they had a nice place, and they were doing a nice brisk business. And this fellow was very close to Pete and I, and he helped us out quite a bit. And so that's how we maneuvered around, and Gary and I became close pals. He was out of work. He couldn't get work because he was an alcoholic, but he was on the wagon, and of course none of the agents would believe him. So at last he got work. See, and of course he met Betty Grable in one of the agent's office, and she had just had work the week before in a musical where she did a little dancing and singing, and she came back that week for the sum of $150, which was big money in those days. So he got acquainted with her, and he was old show people. His mother was an old vaudevillian, a nice little woman, retired, couldn't act anymore. So naturally, they used to go over to their house for dinner because they came with a little money, because she was singing with a band, and I would come up there, and I would sit down for dessert and coffee, which was very nice. So that was a very nice incident. And so the evening I'd go strolling down Hollywood Boulevard, holding hands with Betty Grable. See, I never knew she'd become such an international star. So
Hollywood Boulevard was a lot different in those days than
and it was a
today.
beautiful street with the most beautiful stores and shops and couturier, and the big stars lived up in the hills. There was nothing in Beverly Hills. There was a lot of empty lots, and the only building of any size was today's the Beverly Wilshire, and a few stores. And so things went on, and it was getting bad, and it came election time, and the man who bought our building was a lawyer, the place where Hurley lived. He took it out of bankruptcy. He was the receiver or something, and he was a Democrat, and Roosevelt was running, and so we couldn't pay rent. So I tell you what you do, boys, you go around and canvass for Roosevelt, and for myself, I'm going to run for Congress. See, he never was congressman. His name was Kramer. He was always a Republican in that district, so Pete and I did that. So he raced off the rent that we paid. So we couldn't go on forever. So Pete, meanwhile, was working for Sears in Hollywood on Santa Monica Boulevard, and he was transferred to the San Francisco area.
How did he start with Sears? That's interesting.
Well, he got started with Sears. One of his close friends was already working for Sears, a boy from Chicago who was in bad straits, who got the job from a friend of his and a friend of Pete, who went to grammar school with Pete, who was already a pretty big shot in Sears. So this guy got Pete in by Sears and Santa Monica Boulevard. And he made a big hit right away because he was in big time in Chicago, and there was a bunch of yokels running the department, so they recognized him, immediately transferred him to San Francisco, and gave him charge of the dress department in 3 stores in the Bay Area at a raise, at a very quite big a raise. He started with $15 a week, and in San Francisco they gave him $35 a week. And from San Francisco, he stayed. Then I went to Chicago. No, I didn't go to Chicago yet. So I was hanging around Los Angeles, and I got a job just Saturdays working in a little general store on Main Street. I worked from 8 till 10 o'clock Saturday night for $3. And my mother and I, she came back to Los Angeles, and we had an apartment, a furnished apartment, a single, with an indoor bed, and she used the breakfast room, which had a couch, and did cooking. It was very cheap. Pete used to send $5 a week from San Francisco, and she inveigled Abner out, although he was already in the store, which was financed by your father Joe's boss, who he worked for, see? And your father talked Abner up big, and he financed them in that store, and naturally had a good wage for running the store, and some kind of a deal. And so we got along, but naturally we couldn't make much of a living. So Pete was transferred from San Francisco to Chicago, to the main spot, not any particular position. They took over a big department store in a suburb called Englewood, or Englewood. It was a big private store, and they were going to rehabilitate it and want to call it a Sears store. And Pete was designated to help organize the departments, the ready-to-wear departments. Also got a raise there. He had a nice place in Hyde Park in Chicago, so he told me to come there. In the meantime, your father, you, and Jim and Don was already born, also made a hajira to Chicago, and they had an apartment. And if you remember, you went to school there.
Yeah, Eugene Field
Field
School. I remember that.
And I stayed with Pete in Hyde Park. And
that was 32, 33 in there,
Yeah.
34.
And so I stayed with Pete in Hyde Park, and then he had an apartment closer near Lincoln Park, and I stayed with him. And then he got the call to New York. They saw his ability, and he was called to New York. So naturally, he had his rent paid for another 2 weeks, So I stayed at that apartment. It was a beautiful apartment in what's called, used to be called in the Platinum Coast. Well, I was left, so you had that place on Greenwood, I think the name was. And you had quite an apartment there, so I came and bunked in with you. Had
I remember.
a couch somewhere in the living room.
I remember that.
You remember that. And stayed with you, you went to school. And then I stayed for about 2 weeks, and all of a sudden, Midge got to, I helped your father. He was installing slot machines in restaurants and drugstores. So I worked and helped with him. We used to install those machines, and he used to go to collect the money. And every couple of weeks we changed the machine for a new setup. And he made what you call a fair living for those days.
Was that a business run by Ralph Moore
That
by
was
any chance?
connected with Ralph Moore's brothers.
His brothers.
His
Yeah.
brothers. And that was going pretty good, but Midge got restless, and Abner wrote a letter that should come back to Los Angeles. Well, he picked all of you up, and meanwhile, I got a set up with my cousin Morris, who was a selling agent for cotton goods mills. So I went in with him, and as you people left, I rented a room in a nice little private hotel in Rogers Park. That's a couple of blocks from where you lived. And I saw you all off in the car, all packed your stuff in the car, riding back to Los Angeles. So I stayed with Morris, and from there I started to call on the manufacturers. I took one branch of the business, and then we got connected with a big factory, one of the biggest in the United States, Walter E. Heller and Company, which is called Heller Industrial Financiers. And we opened a department called Fabtex Mills, which I was in charge of. And we worked up quite a business. And then I started to get free. Had a nice little room, which was very reasonable, a maid service, very clean, and right a half a block from the L station. And for $1, I got a pass that I could get on and off any L all over the transportation system. So that's where I call on the trade without having to have a car. And sooner or later, you wouldn't believe it, in a year I had a small bank account, a little savings account. See, and of course I was helped out because every evening I didn't have to pay for any meals because Morris would drive me to his home, which wasn't far from where I lived, which was always a luscious evening meal. He had an old mammy who lived in, who did the cooking. His wife had an income from an annuity. His wife, her first husband died, and Morris was her second husband, and so they lived very nice. And I was taken as part of the family because they were cousins, and his cousins on his mother's side, although they weren't relatives of mine, they all knew my mother first, and she was a young lady.